of civilization, which took place in discussions between the two individuals who represented these outlooks, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill. The story is perhaps best told through the eyes of Franklin Roosevelt's own son, Elliott Roosevelt, who attended and later transcribed many of these discussions.
Winston is at the dinner table, Father, and already giving quite a speech. Shall we go?
He shall come to understand this time. He must. World events are outpacing our resolve.
What do you mean, Father?
Winston would like to think I wasn't serious last time, but tonight is a different story. You know, Elliot, after flying over Africa, I've had some important thoughts about the future of the world. If you look at the Great Salt Flats in southern Tunisia, you can see that at one time it must have been a vast inland sea. You also have the rivers that spring up in the Atlas Mountains to the south and disappear under the Sahara to become subterranean rivers. Why not take these waters and divert this water flow for irrigation? It'd make the Imperial Valley in California look like a cabbage patch. And the salt flats. They were once below the level of the Mediterranean. You could dig a canal straight back to recreate that lake, 150 miles long, 60 miles wide. The Sahara would bloom for hundreds of miles. It is true, wealth! The Sahara is not just sand, it has an amazingly rich potential. Imperialists don't realize what wealth is, what wealth they can create. They've robbed these continents of billions, and all because they were too short-sighted to understand that their billions were pennies compared to the possibilities. Possibilities that must include a better life for the people who inhabit this land.
Just then, Vice President Wallace came in.
I can't take this, Franklin. I just spent an hour talking with the British Foreign Minister. He was trying to convince me that after the war, the United States and the British have to contain the threat of communism. I said, fascism, communism, capitalism all come from the same point of view, and the British economics is no different. And all he could do was stare at the ceiling and spout some hullabaloo about Darwin. These people are the damnedest fools.
Henry, you need more finesse.
Finesse?
You see, most of these folks are just victims of this old system. Their system uses them more than they use it. We've got to be impatiently patient, Henry.
Franklin, we've got our very own fascist here in this country, just waiting to subvert us all over again. We have to move fast to solve this thing.
Yes, but after the war, the cries will come that the present unity will no longer be necessary, and that's when the job will begin, in earnest. One sentence. When we've won the war, I will work with all my might and main to see to it that the United States is not wheedled into the position of accepting any plan that will further France's imperialistic ambitions, or that will aid or abet the British Empire in its imperial ambitions. Winston has got to listen to me this time. He'll find out this time.
Father, Wallace, and I walked into the room together and sat down at the table. There were pleasant jokes and light discussion for most of the evening. After everyone had eaten, and making sure the Prime could hear him, Father began to talk loudly to one of the guests.
You know, my friend over there doesn't understand how most of our people feel about Britain and her role in the life of other peoples. It's in the American tradition, this distrust, this dislike and even hatred of Britain. There are many kinds of Americans, of course, but as a people, as a country, we're opposed to imperialism. We can't stomach it.
He looked at Churchill with a smile significantly. The Prime Minister sat like a Buddha, a big cigar in his face.
The point, which I am having a hard time getting across to some people, is that many Americans are anti-British. Take me. God knows, and my friend knows, I'm not anti-British now, but I remember very clearly that when I was 7 or thereabouts, in 1889 or 90, and my mother took me to England, and we saw Queen Victoria drive in her carriage down a London street, why, I hated the old woman.
At this point, most of the dinner guests slowly made their way out of the room, while Churchill sat there, sinking in his chair, immediately lighting another cigar. By the time the room cleared out, it was only Father, Churchill, Wallace, and myself. The discussion had turned to policies for after the war and Father's plans for a new economic system.
Those empire trade agreements are a case in point. It's because of them that the people of India and Africa, of all the colonial Near East and Far East, are still as backward as they are.
Mr. President, England does not propose for a moment to lose its favored position amongst the British dominions. The trade that has made England great shall continue, and under conditions prescribed by England's ministers.
Alexander Hamilton's reports prove that our American system strengthens the economy through developing the population. This is what has always worked and will work. It's principled. I am drafting a pamphlet to bring about the industrialization of China. We could start tomorrow.
You have no idea what a mistake you would be making with that. We feel...
I am firmly of the belief that if we are to arrive at a stable peace, it must involve the development of backward countries, backward peoples. How can this be done? It can't be done, obviously, by 18th century methods.
Who's talking 18th century methods?
Whichever of your ministers recommends a policy which takes wealth and raw materials out of a nation, but which returns nothing to the people of that country in consideration. 20th century methods involve bringing industry to these colonies. 20th century methods include increasing the wealth of the people by increasing their standard of living, by education, by bringing sanitation, by making sure they get a return for the raw wealth of their community. Take India, Winston. I can't believe that we can fight a war against fascist slavery and at the same time not work to free people all over the world from a backward colonial policy.
There can be no tampering with the Empire's economic agreement.
They're artificial.
They're the foundation of our greatness. Mr. President, I believe you are trying to do away with the British Empire. Every idea you entertain demonstrates it. But in spite of that, we know that you constitute our only hope. And you know that we know it. You know that we know that without America, the Empire won't stand.
Once Churchill had enough, he forced a smile, got up, and cordially bid us a good evening. As he waddled away, Father picked up his things and spoke confidently, to himself, but also to me.
The choice is ours, you know. We have a chance to use our influence in favor of a more united and cooperating world. This nation has a rendezvous with history.
Roosevelt's vision of the post-war agreements between the Big Four, the United States, Britain, China, and the Soviet Union, were for them to be responsible, under the principles of the Atlantic Charter, to form the United Nations, which would oversee the banishment of colonialism worldwide and bring the power of technological development to nations across the globe. Under the leadership of President Roosevelt, the United States created a potential for global cooperation, threatening the end of imperialism on the planet. For the first time since Lincoln's victory in the Civil War, the world was moving in the direction of defeating the oligarchical principle and establishing a global community of sovereign nation-states. Under the presidency of Roosevelt's chosen successor, Vice President Henry Wallace, that future would have been secured.
Some have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering, the century which will come out of this war, can be and must be the century of the common man. If we really believe we are fighting for a people's peace, all the rest becomes easy. This is a fight between a slave world and a free world. Just as the United States in 1862 could not remain half slave and half free, so in 1942 the world must make its decision for a complete victory one way or the other. The people, in their millennial and revolutionary march toward manifesting here on earth the dignity that is in every human soul, hold as their credo the four freedoms enunciated by President Roosevelt. We who live in the United States may think there is nothing very revolutionary about freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and freedom from the fear of secret police. But when we begin to think about the significance of freedom from want for the average man, then we know that the revolution of the past 150 years has not been completed, either here in the United States or in any other nation in the world. We know that this revolution cannot stop until freedom from want has been attained.
Tragically, President Roosevelt's health then took a dramatic turn for the worse, and as the war was coming to a close, the British operatives in the Democratic Party pressured Roosevelt to replace Wallace with Harry S. Truman in the 1944 election. Truman was not committed to fighting for Roosevelt's principles, but had proven himself willing to submit to Churchill's post-war outlook. By April 1945, OSS Chief William Donovan met President Roosevelt in the Oval Office. Upon his departure, having witnessed the president's condition, Donovan grimly remarked to his trusted aide, "It's over. It's all over." As President Roosevelt was laid in the ground, the British and Dutch were allowed to re-enter Africa, Indochina, Indonesia, and other nations on the brink of independence and recolonize. 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on the nation of Japan by Harry Truman, even as that nation was entering surrender terms. Instead of collaboration for rebuilding the world, the U.S. followed Britain's plan into a nuclear standoff with Russia, which would divide the world for the next 40 years. The U.S. presidency was, with a few exceptions, steered by the British to revive free trade as the hegemonic system of the global economy. Leaders like John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy, who challenged these problems, were assassinated. The intended policies of Franklin Roosevelt for the post-war world are still waiting to be implemented today.
Lincoln was assassinated. The British were out to kill him. And they did. In some ways, maybe that's easier to deal with. We should have kept Lincoln alive. But Roosevelt, he died. That seems to be a random event. It leads to a certain existential outlook. But what if we thought of it in a different way? What if we thought, no, see, he doesn't really die if we don't let him die. We have the ability as human beings to keep alive that which was unique about him. His mental capability, his discoveries, his social dissemination of ideas, his creativity in organizing other people. If we kept that alive as a universe where the minds of people is what we valued, what they discovered, what they act on as human beings, going back to this idea that Roosevelt discovered it was his person, not his physical being, then their death would diminish them less. They'd be more alive in us.
It is the leadership of individuals, not the unfolding of events, which determines world history. Now is the time for a new generation of Americans to revive the legacy of FDR and Lincoln and rise up to relegate the British Empire to the trash bin of history once and for all.
In a symbolic gesture, American troops destroy the Nazi Party emblem.